Darkness stretched infinitely in all directions, the cold void of space disturbed only by the silent presence of a lone warship. It hung at the edge of the Tartarus expanse, a desolate sector that had become the last line of defense between Earth's colonies and annihilation. The Leviathan, a behemoth of steel and plasma, sat in eerie stillness, its hull absorbing the distant glow of a dying star. Deep within, Captain Dorian Kane stood on the command deck, eyes locked on the holographic projection before him, a battlefield yet to be claimed. The ship was a marvel of human engineering. Sleek, deadly, and outfitted with prototype Singularity-based weaponry, it was unlike anything the Terra Navy had fielded before. But a single warship, no matter how advanced, was not meant to hold against an entire armada. The numbers were damning. 500 enemy vessels, a force designed to wipe civilizations from existence, all converging on one ship. Kane exhaled slowly. Fear had long since burned away, leaving only cold calculation. He had fought the Zelvari Dominion before. Brutal, merciless, convinced of their own supremacy. This time, they came not to conquer, but to exterminate. Their high warlord, Zypher, had issued the message himself. No human would leave the system alive. A flicker of light pulsed across the darkened bridge as Nemesis, the ship's AI, materialized in a stream of shifting code. Enemy fleet estimated to arrive in 16 hours. Scans indicate a three-pronged formation, designed for rapid encirclement. The voice was precise, devoid of emotion, but Kane knew better. It was watching, learning, adapting, not leaving much room to maneuver, Kane muttered. He traced a finger along the hollow display, marking potential strike points. They expect a fleet, not one ship. That's their weakness. Reyna Vasquez, his tactical officer, leaned over the console. One ship or not, we're still outgunned. If the Singularity cannons don't hold up in a prolonged engagement, they won't, Kane admitted, which is why we won't give them one. A chuckle came from the engineering station. Malcolm Grimm Harlow, grease-covered and grinning despite the odds, wiped his hands on his uniform. So, we hit hard, run fast, and hope the ship doesn't fall apart? I like it. Nemesis pulsed. Statistically, our survival rate is less than 0.07%. Grimm whistled. That high? Must be our lucky day. Kane smirked but said nothing. He didn't need statistics. He needed results. Beyond the bridge, the Leviathan's crew moved with the efficiency of those who knew they were already dead. Weapons were prepped, shields calibrated. The Singularity Core, humanity's greatest gamble, remained dormant. Its power locked behind safety protocols even the most desperate admiral had feared to override. Kane had no such reservations. The hours slipped by. The distant stars remained indifferent. Then, at precisely 1,600 hours, proximity alarms shattered the silence. They're here, Vasquez whispered. Kane straightened. The hollow display erupted in warning markers. 500 vessels, the Zelvari fleet emerging from subspace in a stagger formation. Their capital ships, monstrous behemoths bristling with energy cannons, took position at the center. Swarms of fighter drones filled the gaps, their movements precise, mechanical. A transmission blinked into existence. The image of High Warlord Zypher filled the screen, his reptilian features twisted in amusement. Golden eyes burned with the certainty of a predator. Human, you are outnumbered, outmatched, and alone. Surrender, and I will grant you a swift death. Kane tilted his head, eyes cold. I was hoping you'd say that. He cut the feed. All hands. His voice rang through the ship, steady and unwavering. Prepare for battle. The Leviathan moved. Engines roared to life, and the Leviathan surged forward, cutting through the void like a predator stalking prey. The Zelvari fleet moved to intercept, capital ships shifting into a net designed to box them in. It was a flawless strategy against a conventional force. But Kane had no intention of fighting conventionally. Fire at will, he ordered. The Leviathan's forward cannons unleashed a devastating salvo, ionized lances of plasma ripping through the first wave of fighters. Zelvari's ships moved to compensate, shifting their formation to counter what they believed was a desperate attack. That was their first mistake. "Deploy decoys," Vasquez called out. Nemesis complied instantly. Dozens of false sensor signatures erupted across the battlefield, each mimicking the Leviathan's energy output. Enemy weapons fire scattered, chasing ghosts. A single Zelvari dreadnought hesitated, scanning to recalibrate. Kane saw the opening. Hard burn, flank and disable. Grim pushed the ship's engines past their safety threshold. The sudden speed shift caught the enemy off guard, and before they could adjust, the Leviathan was beneath them. Fire singularity cannons. A brilliant sphere of collapsing gravity tore through the dreadnought's hull, ripping the ship in half before it could fire a single shot. The wreckage spiraled outward, slamming into a nearby corvette. 2 kills in seconds. But the Zelvari were quick learners. The moment their dreadnought fell, the fleet adapted. Destroyers repositioned, heavy guns locking onto the Leviathan's path. Incoming torpedoes. Impact in. The first explosion slammed into the starboard side, throwing sparks across the bridge. Shields flared, struggling to hold. Kane gritted his teeth. Evasive maneuvers. The ship twisted violently, engines screaming as Nemesis redirected power to the thrusters. Torpedoes scraped past the hull, detonating just beyond reach, but the force still rattled the decks. "Shields at 60%, Nemesis reported. "We can't outgun them," Vasquez said. "We need cover." Kane's eyes flicked across the tactical map. The asteroid field, a graveyard of shattered moons and planetary debris. A natural kill zone. Head for the field. Full speed. The Leviathan veered sharply. The Zelvari hesitated only a moment before pursuing, their arrogance overriding caution. They believed it was desperation. They believed wrong. The ship plunged into the asteroid belt at breakneck speed. Chunks of rock tumbled in all directions, some the size of cities, others no bigger than a drop pod. Kane turned to Nemesis. "Redirect shields to kinetic absorption. Start feeding enemy targeting data into the debris field." A second later, Zelvari gunners saw dozens of false enemy signals appear among the asteroids. Their AI-assisted targeting faltered, unable to distinguish between ship and rock. Several destroyers fired blindly and paid the price. A colossal chunk of ice and metal, caught in the crossfire, shattered into jagged shards. The debris shredded an entire squadron of Zelvari interceptors before they could react. A destroyer, its sensors overloaded with false targets, slammed directly into a drifting asteroid, breaking apart on impact. 2 more down, Vasquez confirmed, eyes gleaming. "They're getting sloppy." Not sloppy, angry. And an angry enemy made mistakes. The remaining Zelvari ships pulled back, regrouping at the edge of the asteroid field. Then, without warning, something changed. "Energy spike detected," Nemesis announced. "They're deploying an EMP wave." Kane's stomach dropped. A ripple of blue light swept through the field. The asteroids dimmed as their latent magnetic charges were stripped away. Then the ship's controls flickered. Lights dimmed. Screens cut to static. The hum of the engine stuttered, then fell silent. The Leviathan was dead in the water. Restarting auxiliary systems, Grim growled, fingers flying across the console. "We'll be back online in 60 seconds. They didn't have 60 seconds. The Zelvari fleet advanced, their confidence restored. The lead battleship charged its weapons, locking onto the Leviathan's exposed flank. Kane's mind raced. They needed a way to buy time. Something, anything, to stall the kill shot. His eyes flicked to the singularity cannon's readout. Still active. "Divert remaining power to a partial singularity pulse," he ordered. Nemesis hesitated. At this range, the gravitational distortion may. "Do it." A low hum vibrated through the ship as the singularity cannon charged with the last vestiges of energy. Kane barely had time to brace before it fired. Not at the enemy, but at the asteroids behind them. A fraction of a black hole ripped through space. The explosion sent a shockwave of debris cascading outward. Dozens of asteroids, some as large as warships, slammed into the Zelvari formation at devastating speeds. Destroyers vanished in bursts of flame. A battleship took a direct hit to its engines, careening helplessly into another ship before both detonated. The Zelvari fleet reeled, and in that moment of chaos, Grimm's voice rang out. Systems restored. Kane didn't hesitate. Get us out of here. Now. The Leviathan vanished into the dark. The void stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. The Leviathan drifted through the aftermath, hull scorched, shields struggling to regenerate. Every system groaned under the strain of battle, but they were still here. The same could not be said for half the Zelvari fleet. Kane watched the tactical display. The wreckage of enemy vessels scattered across the field. Fires burned in the vacuum, flickering embers of what had once been a flawless armada. The enemy had underestimated them. That mistake had cost them dearly, but it was far from over. A proximity alert blared. The remaining Zelvari forces were regrouping, their capital ships taking a defensive stance, weapons primed. They had learned. They wouldn't rush in again. They would tighten their formation, use their overwhelming firepower to grind the Leviathan down until there was nothing left. Damage report, Kane ordered. Shields at 40%, Vasquez said, wiping sweat from her brow. Hull integrity compromised, but we're still holding. Weapon systems at 70% efficiency. Grimm let out a rough chuckle. Could be worse. Could be dead. We're not done yet, Kane said. His eyes locked onto the lead Zelvari warship, Zypher's flagship. That was the key. The fleet still moved in tight formation around it. Even now, they relied on his command, his coordination. Remove him, and they would fracture. Can we get a firing solution on the flagship? Nemesis pulsed, considering. At this range, probability of a direct hit is 22%. Not good enough. They needed to get closer. Kane studied the enemy formation. They were tightening their defenses, locking down gaps. If the Leviathan made a direct charge, it would be suicide. But if they made the enemy come to them, he turned to Vasquez. How much power do we have left in the Singularity Core? She hesitated. Enough for one more shot. Maybe two if we reroute life support. He nodded. That won't be necessary. Charge the Singularity cannon. But don't fire. Confusion flickered across the crew's faces, but they obeyed. The energy signature of the cannon grew, radiating across the battlefield like a beacon. And just as Kane had predicted, the Zelvari took the bait. A transmission came through. Zypher's face twisted in barely restrained fury. You think to threaten me with your pitiful weapon? You are nothing. Your ship is dying, your crew broken. Surrender, and I will spare them. Kane allowed himself a small smile. Funny, you don't sound so confident anymore. Zypher bared his fangs. You die here, human. The transmission cut. Across the field, the Zelvari formation shifted. Not a full advance, not yet, but a calculated push, moving their heavy warships into position, adjusting their angles. They wanted to neutralize the Leviathan's cannon before it could fire again. Exactly what Kane had counted on. He turned to Grimm. Set engines to minimum output. Make it look like we're stalling. Grimm grinned. Oh, I like where this is going. The Leviathan slowed, its thrusters dimming, just barely drifting forward. To the Zelvari, it would seem as if the ship was at its limit, struggling to stay operational. The enemy moved in, tightening their noose. Then Kane gave the order. All power to forward thrusters. Now, the ship lurched forward, accelerating at a velocity the enemy had not expected. Their formation had narrowed, their warships clustered too tightly. They had trapped themselves. Fire aft torpedoes. Explosions erupted behind them as the Leviathan's torpedoes tore through the pursuing ships. The Zelvari in the rear line scrambled, colliding in their panic. Kane didn't bother looking back. His focus was on one thing. Zypher's flagship loomed ahead. Target engines. Fire everything. The ship shuddered as every operational cannon unleashed hell. Plasma rounds slammed into the flagship's rear thrusters, ripping through armor, sending shockwaves through its structure. The Zelvari tried to compensate, adjusting shields, returning fire, but it was too late. Hit confirmed, Vasquez called out. They're losing propulsion. The flagship listed, struggling against its own momentum. Kane saw the panic ripple through the enemy fleet. Their leader was crippled, and with him their cohesion. Then in one final strike, the Singularity cannon fired. The shot wasn't at full power, but it didn't need to be. The gravitational pulse struck the flagship directly amidships, the ship folding inward on itself, torn apart by forces it was never meant to withstand. Zypher's vessel fractured, explosions rippling along its length before it vanished into nothingness. Silence fell. The remaining Zelvari ships hesitated. Without their leader, without their formation, they were exposed. Vulnerable. Kane exhaled. They're going to run. And he was right. One by one, the Zelvari ships began to peel away, retreating into the void. The battle was over. The impossible had been done. The Leviathan stood alone. The battlefield was silent now, save for the distant echoes of dying ships and the hum of Leviathan's systems struggling to stabilize. Fires burned in the wreckage, shattered hulls drifting lifelessly through the void. What had been an armada, an unstoppable force meant to wipe humanity from existence, was now nothing more than debris. Kane stood on the bridge, staring at the tactical display. The remaining Zelvari forces had fled, their retreat an admission of defeat. The impossible had happened. One ship had turned the tide against an entire fleet. But survival had come at a cost. Status report, he ordered. Vasquez scanned the readout, her face grim. Shields are barely holding at 12%. Structural damage across multiple decks. We've lost half our missile reserves, and the Singularity core is nearly depleted. Grim let out a heavy breath. Engines are still functional, but we're running on fumes. We won't be winning another fight anytime soon. Kane nodded. It was enough. They had survived. The Zelvari would think twice before attempting another extermination strike. But this war was far from over. A faint pulse flickered on the display. An incoming transmission. Not from the enemy. This signal was Terran. Kane opened the channel. Admiral Rains appeared, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the command deck of a Terran battleship buzzed with activity. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Captain Kane, she said, voice firm but laced with something that almost sounded like disbelief. We picked up the remnants of the battle. The reports are difficult to process. Kane gave a tired smirk. Trust me, Admiral. Living through it wasn't any easier. She studied him, then the wreckage beyond his viewport. One ship, against an entire Zelvari fleet. A pause. This will change everything. It already had. Humanity had been seen as an underdog in this war, always reacting, always surviving by the skin of its teeth. But this was something else entirely. This was proof that they could win. Rains exhaled. We're moving to secure the sector. The Zelvari will regroup, but they'll be wary now. You've given us breathing room. And that's more than anyone could have hoped for. Kane's gaze didn't leave the wreckage. They'll be back. They will, she agreed. Then, after a brief pause, and so will you. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an order. It was a simple fact. Kane didn't hesitate. Count on it. The transmission cut. Silence settled over the bridge once more. The crew, battered and exhausted, shared weary glances. They had done the impossible, but they all knew this war was far from over. Grim cracked his knuckles. So, we gonna limp home, or are we sticking around to scavenge some souvenirs? Vasquez rolled her eyes. You're insane. Kane allowed himself a small smile. They had earned a moment of levity, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He turned to Nemesis. Set course for the nearest outpost. We need repairs. The AI's voice was calm, calculating, acknowledged, engaging sublight engines. The Leviathan turned, its hull scarred but unbroken, and disappeared into the void.